The obvious question that arises as we talk about climate change and global warming is, well, exactly how long has the planet's climate been changing? Any thoughts on that?
Ever since we became a planet with an atmosphere
Really,
and
well,
rotation and an
I
uneven surface.
I believe that predates the invention of the SUV, does it not?
Yeah, climate is one of those variables that the nature of climate has changed.
How long has the planet been warming on and off?
The planet has been warming on and off for that same period of time, probably about 3 billion years.
We also know, toward the end of the Little Ice Age, also within recorded history, that exorcisms were being performed on glaciers and people being burned as witches because they were causing this terrible period of cold. And I can't help but see certain parallels between those days and these. My friends on the other side of the aisle remind me of something Ogden Nash once wrote. He said, "The ass was born in March, the rains came in November. Such a flood as this," he said, "I scarcely can remember." Can we not reasonably expect that the planet is going to continue to warm and cool as it has for billions of years, whether or not we deliberately impoverish our economy?
Yes, and there will be an additional increment probably of greenhouse warming in the 21st century.
Let me make one other, I'm out of time.
So let's go back to 1715. Let's think about the fact that the Delaware River was always frozen in the winter. It was always cooler than it is now, because when Washington crossed the Delaware, they were dodging ice chunks to get across the river to get to fight the Hessians that were camped on the other side. There were years in Europe when summer never came, and it's documented.
I agree with Ms. Lomas. I don't disagree with climate change. I do disagree, and I'm not a believer in man-made climate change. I think the climate's been changing, as we've heard testimony earlier, since the beginning of time. A lot of Greenland was ice-free, so the Nords settled on that area, and they fished. Those are the facts that can be proven. There are parts of the world that don't have access to ready, reliable, affordable fossil fuels to generate electricity. Because of that failure to have electricity, they can't have incubators or generators to do C-sections. Children die. The infant mortality rate in areas that don't have access to cheap, reliable, predictable electricity provided by fossil fuels have very low life expectancies. Fossil fuels work. That's the social cost and the moral cost of not having cheap, reliable fossil fuels. With that, I yield back.
So until the EPA figures out how to permit and regulate acts of God, then there's not really anything we can do about autogenic greenhouse gases.
And Dr. Michaels, I was reading here that the warming of the late 20th century, as well as the cessation of warming that occurred since 1998, fall well within the range of natural climate variability. That seems to be an ongoing issue. If I understand right from history, which was my major in college, at the time of Eric the Red and others sailing, actually things appear to have been warmer in Greenland than they are today, more ability to farm. Anybody care to comment on that?
It wasn't called Greenland because it was red.
Pardon?
It wasn't called Greenland because it was red.
Apparently there was a lot of carbon emissions from those sailing vessels that came across the Atlantic. I yield back.
Yeah, I'm a physician by training. What we do is we evaluate things based on evidence, what we call evidence-based science. That's why modern medicine is so far advanced just since the 40s. So that's key here. Now, from the data, what I see is that there's a 0% accuracy in prediction of global warming, which, by the way, experts tell me that if you can't predict it, you don't understand it. So we have a 0% prediction of global warming, but we have 100% accuracy when it comes to economic damage of global warming policies in terms of shutting down coal-fired plants. Since when did truth and science develop out of consensus? I don't get that. We don't get doctors together in a room and say, we don't know the answers to these questions, but we'll just take a vote and we'll decide that that's the truth and that's how we're going to treat disease. I've never seen that happen, but that is exactly what is happening with this global warming policy efforts.
Just as the President has used Department of Justice, the IRS, the Department of Homeland Security as a political weapon, he now has expanded his arsenal to include a new tool for the EPA and his regulatory henchmen. The far-reaching application of this new climate change model is so broad and inaccurate that there is no telling how many jobs will be lost as the President seeks to further his far-left political agenda by any and all means necessary. Now, Mr. Siegel, it's great to see you. In your opinion, why the secrecy, and why didn't one of the President's minions show up today to answer questions about the application of this new climate change model?
One basis for this conclusion is the uncertainty that swirls around the models used to determine social cost. This uncertainty falls short of the complete analytic defense and rational connection between factual inputs, modeling assumptions, and conclusions that has long been required by federal courts as part of administrative law.
Now, one comment was made earlier in this hearing that the value that the administration has selected for the SCC is not based on peer-reviewed information. I'd like to correct that. The SCC was estimated using 3 integrated assessment models called FUND, DICE, and PAGE, each of which are widely cited in the peer-reviewed literature and which are used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. There was also a criticism that there was a lack of public input in this process. Look, the first SCC estimates were released in February of 2010. Dozens of opportunities existed for public comment about the SCC directly and about rules that incorporated the SCC, so I didn't want to let those falsehoods go unrebutted.
My name is Kevin Diaratna. I'm the Senior Statistician and Research Programmer at the Heritage Foundation here in Washington, D.C. The views I express in this testimony are my own and should not be construed as representing any official position of the Heritage Foundation. Under some assumptions, there are actually substantial probabilities of a negative social cost of carbon. Under some assumptions, the social cost of carbon is negative 2/3 of the time. This would suggest that there are literally no costs, but rather benefits to carbon dioxide emissions, and if taken at face value, this would suggest that the government should subsidize, not tax, carbon dioxide emissions.
Should we be reducing greenhouse gas emissions in order to lessen the impact on climate? Yes or no?
The short answer is no.
No.
You know, Dr. Diaratna, you began your testimony with something that has been intoned by many witnesses from the Heritage Foundation. The views I express are my own and do not necessarily represent those of the Heritage Foundation. Let me ask you a couple of questions.
Go ahead.
Dr. Diaratna. You are an employee of the Heritage Foundation, are you not?
Correct.
They pay you for working there, is that right?
Correct.
Are you on working hours right now?
I mean, I don't see how that's relevant right now.
Do they know you're here?
Yes,
If
they do
you
know
don't want
I'm
me
here.
to tell anybody,
Yes, they
keep
do
it
know I'm
safe
here,
with
yes.
me.
Yes.
I couldn't help noticing that you submitted written testimony as well, is that
Yes.
right? That appears to be on Heritage Foundation stationery.
Yes, it's right here.
Are you allowed to use company stationery?
Well, yes. I mean, to be quite honest, if a professor from a university comes here and testifies, they may submit their testimony on a university letterhead.
Thank you.
That doesn't mean that they're
expect you to be
testifying
quite honest, Dr. Diaratna.
on behalf of the university.
What I did notice when I went on the official website of the Heritage Foundation is it says in black and white, climate policy is used too often as a vehicle to advance special interests and politically driven agendas that centralize more power in Washington, and that's the official view. And it appears to be that they're against climate change regulations.
You work for an organization that not only takes fossil fuel funding, it takes funding from the 2 organizations, Donors Trust and Donors Capital Fund, which are the largest funder funders of client denial efforts. Does this money ever end up in your pocket?
Congressman, I do not interact with any of the donors whatsoever. And in
I-
fact,
I-
on the last page of my
I
testimony,
appreciate your willingness, desire to answer the question. Time has elapsed.
okay.
Climate change is very real to my constituents and me, and it is happening now. And to those who deny the science of climate change, including those in today's panel, then please come join me, and I will bring you to a place that has the physical evidence of rising seas. And in the case of climate change, so many of these things that are historically omitted from a cost-benefit analysis are the things that affect those at the margins first and worst. When agricultural productivity goes down and food prices go up, low-income communities are hit the hardest. When jobs are lost from tourism, the lowest income folks often have the fewest options. When drinking water becomes more rare and more expensive, those without means suffer the most. And if these important impacts are omitted from cost-benefit analysis, they do not exist in the eyes of decision makers.
One of the things that we looked at the Joint Center a couple of years back was the way in which that the response to climate change was very uneven across the country. And we find places like Mr. Saban pointed out where people are already suffering the early effects of this unfolding problem. So we need an SEC that really focus upon the disproportionate impacts of climate change around the country.
And by setting a consistent value for the cost of carbon, which many companies are already doing on their own, doesn't the social cost of carbon actually provide some long overdue certainty for the private sector?
Absolutely. A great number of companies in your district, as well as in many other members in this committee's districts, are proposing actually quite more stringent steps in reducing emissions, their own company emissions. And because the reality is that doing so is good for their bottom line.
Are we already paying for these costs?
Well, absolutely. I mean, you take, for example, in Alaska, where a great number of communities are already in the process of relocating. The low end of some of those community relocation estimates put them in the 200s of millions of dollars. The sort of the middle range, $500 million to relocate communities that are suffering the effects of essentially rising sea level on the North Slope of Alaska. We pay a great number of costs in terms of the health effects from carbon pollution. We do indeed pay these costs, whether or not we decide to make the calculation or not. I guess I would add, since the conversation has moved this way a little bit, that I just emphasize the point that this is not a new sort of approach. It's one that's rooted in the peer review literature, and more importantly, it's not a static measure. It's one that we can reevaluate and come back to and adjust going forward as we learn more about the severity of the unfolding climate crisis. And
for years, the world's top economists have been saying that in not accounting for climate change, we have created a market failure. Let's be clear, a market failure. The market currently fails to account for the costs associated with greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. Polluting industries are pumping out greenhouse gases free of charge, but others, such as taxpayers, property owners, and also healthcare systems are and will be paying for the resulting damage to property and human health, to name just two impacted sectors. To help correct for this market failure, the social cost of carbon, or what I'll call SCC, puts the effects of these greenhouse gas emissions into a monetary context so that the agencies and taxpayers can understand the impacts of their actions on infrastructure, on health, and food security.
So if the Industrial Revolution correlates with increased carbon emissions, and the Industrial Revolution also correlates with increased social benefits, is it fair to say that as carbon emissions have increased, the social benefits to society have increased?
I believe I said that earlier.
Yes.
not exactly.
Could you explain that more?
Well, I mean, it doesn't necessarily follow. Technology isn't a static thing. Certainly, you certainly must be aware of this based on the questioning here. So it just so happens that we found some technologies that have been around actually a while that don't need us to rely on fossil fuels and don't need us to rely on increasing emissions. And so there's an opportunity we have to deploy those technologies. Those are technologies in the renewable space in terms of wind energy, in terms of solar energy. And they
many of those technologies we were using before the Industrial Revolution, such as biomass and
well,
wind.
on the wind side, we certainly were using them, and indeed, and actually the evolution of wind, comes before the Industrial Revolution and has picked up in a certain way where now we have the ability to do not just terrestrial wind, but tremendous amount of power generation from offshore wind.
So we've developed technologies to better harness the renewables in the future.
Indeed, and so we can cut our reliance on fossil fuels.
And Mr. C.
Our illustration graphically shows the major differences that have evolved between what the administration uses and the new scientific reality. The higher probabilities in the Rowe and Baker determination resulted mainly because of the extremely wide range of estimates for the cooling effects of sulfate aerosols. Recently, these have been dramatically narrowed by researchers Nick Lewis and by Judith Curry of Georgia Tech, resulting in a vanishingly small probability of major warming. That would be the next image. And you can see there the mean warming predicted for doubling CO2 sensitivity is around 1.3, and the high-end tails are very, very vanishingly small. As my colleague Kevin Diaratna will show, the newer, more constrained science results in a dramatic lowering of the SCC. Here is another major scientific shortcoming in the administration's calculation of the SCC. Thousands of scientific papers written around the world demonstrate the direct fertilization effect of atmospheric carbon dioxide on agricultural output. A recent literature review by Dr. Craig Itzo shows it results in a 10 to 15% increase in the overall yield of major food crops, contributing to an increase in global agricultural output of $3.2 trillion since 1961. Properly including this well-documented information, as will be demonstrated by Diaratna, can result in a negative social cost of carbon or a net external benefit from the combustion of carbon dioxide. In closing, I implore the committee to require the administration, next image, to back up their calculation of the SCC with real reproducible science. This graphic was shown to this committee on May 13th by Dr. John Christie. I need say nothing more about it. It is a stark representation of the failure of the climate models that form the basis for the administration's calculation of the social cost of carbon. Those who deny this are denying science.
Dr. Michaels, your sensitivity estimates that you've given us to reflect, which you say reflect this new scientific reality. I just want to say that in the past you also have had a number of other predictions. You predicted that the Toyota Prius would never be profitable because clean energy couldn't be cost-effective at scale. It's now the third best-selling car. You attacked the mainstream scientific position on the depletion of the stratospheric ozone layer, and now we understand that the mainstream position was right. On climate change, you wrote in 2013, it's a pretty good bet that we're going to go nearly a quarter of a century without warming. And now we know that 2014 was the hottest year on record by many indicators. So with that kind of background, I'm just trying to understand who you are. You're a member scientist of the Advancement of Sound Science Coalition, which is an organization that was created and funded by the tobacco industry to fight anti-tobacco legislation. Now you work for Cato, which is a documented climate denier funding, and you're asking us to trust you on that. Were you a member of were you a member scientist, or did you play a role in the Advancement of Sound Science Coalition?
That was very long ago.
Were you?
If I played a role, it was certainly minimal.
Were you a member? Were you a member?
Yes, I was. I was
Thank you.
Not active. May I answer your question, your assertion about no warming for 25 years, and then you said, well, 2015 is a very warm year, so you have to be wrong about that.
2013.
2013, 2015, whatever. The fact of the
No,
matter
you said in
is,
2013 it's going to be a quarter of a century
it will be a
without
quarter.
warming, and we now know that 2014 was the hottest.
Yeah, but that did not induce a significant warming trend.